Well, good morning, Green Prix race teams. This is a video specific for the Goblins. Like most events, afterwards I think back on what I saw, and one of the things I saw, per the title here, is issues with the Goblins and front suspension steering. I think we can all admit the Goblin steering system leaves a lot to be desired, but it is what it is, and all cars have basically the same system. So why is it that some cars seem to track perfectly straight, track through the slaloms nicely, and in others it seems like the drivers are really fighting with the steering? Is a little of that down to the kind of white-knuckle death grip on the steering wheel, over controlling the steering? Sure. But what I saw on quite a few cars was a loose front wheel, front suspension piece. And that does a lot of bad things for the driver. So that's why I figured I would put together this video. I'm going to go back and forth from small me to big me in the picture there, because I want to go through some of the parts and actually show them what they look like, what the names are, so we're all kind of on the same page. Okay, so that's me again, Mike Reiki, Green Prix race director. That was a car I drove in high school, right-hand drive Mini Cooper. Okay, so the agenda. We'll go through the parts, what they're called, so you can understand them. If we need to order some more, Green Power, their website store, is getting a little bit better stocked. So there are some more parts available than used to be. But the problems with loose wheels, and then there's another problem associated with the steering, and that's over-tightening the steering bolts that go through this steering arm. Okay, and we'll go through that. Some adjustments you can make to get rid of that slop and make the car much more drivable. And guess what? It'll make it faster too. And then I have one tip kind of for race prep, really testing your adjustments on the front and the steering. And then the next video I'm going to put together in a couple of weeks is on race prep, because one of the questions I get often is, how come that car is so fast? Well, could it be that they've fresher batteries? Maybe. Batteries do degrade over time. A better, newer motor? Maybe. Unlikely, but those do degrade as well. We have had a couple motors burn up. But a lot of speed comes from race preparation, making the car the best it can be before it shows up. Okay? And while I'm thinking about that, I'll put it in the test or the tips for race prep video. Your car should show up to tech 100% ready to race. I know there are occasional things. We had one team was testing it the night before and the belt snapped, and they didn't have a spare. We did. I mean, that's one of those things. Yes, we'll fix that in tech. But doing routine maintenance on a car at the track, you're not prepared well enough, and that's why your car oftentimes is so slow, right? So the parts. Yeah, here I'm going to switch. This is probably going to be somewhat rudimentary, so it's not going to win any Academy Awards. Let's see how I can do this. Oh, there we go. Oof. You know, my picture always gets in the way. This is even bigger. Let's see how this works. So, okay, parts. The wheel itself. Dun, da, 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 nothing fancy. But on these wheels, orient to the camera. It's tough when it's backwards. On both sides, there is what's called a retaining cap, this black ring, and that's what holds the bearing that goes inside the wheel, holds it in there so it doesn't fall out. Okay, and I've taken the one off of the backside here so I can slip it easily in and out. So we'll put that bearing in. It goes in and it butts up against that retaining ring, and then there's another one on the backside that holds that bearing in the center of the wheel itself. These are what are called non-driven wheels. They just roll. On the Goblins, there's one wheel that's driven, and the way you can tell is it doesn't have these retaining caps or a bearing. It has a cutout where the pin, the drive pin, mates up with the wheel, and that's what makes the wheel turn. It doesn't move at all on the axle. It's on there with the pin and a bolt on the other side to hold it. That's your drive wheel. And then you have three of these non-driven wheels, and both front wheels are non-driven. They just rotate on this bearing, and that's what we're going to talk about. I showed you the bearing, 3 non-driven wheels, so 3 bearings naturally. The retaining caps, the black rings on the outside. What's known as either the stub axle or the steering arm. I think on Green Power they call it the stub axle, but it's this piece, right? And I've got this labeled because they are what's called sided. This is the left side. So on the car, well, this is going to be fun. It would look something like that. Your steering mechanism connects to this arm, and that's what, when you turn the steering wheel, it turns this, the wheel sits on this stub axle. All right. These are a little bit flimsy, this arm right here. This part's pretty beefy. And now what goes through this hole is the bolt. Simple enough. But the thing with these bolts, like almost all of the bolts on the Green Pre cars, they come with what's known as a self-locking nut. I don't know how well you can see that, but on the outside of the nut, there's a little white piece of plastic, and it's known as a self-locking nut. On this side, it looks like a normal nut. So what happens? You screw that onto the bolt. I know they have these on the seats. And what often happens is you tighten it down, and as soon as the bolt hits that white plastic material, you can't turn it with your fingers anymore. And people think, well, it's tight. Well, it's not. I mean, look how much is left to tighten up on that. So what you have to do is snug it down, and that white plastic, what it does is it keeps the nut from coming loose on the car during the race. Okay, so just be aware of that. And when we talk about tightening these, you can underdo it like this, where it's just touching the plastic, or you can overdo it, what I call gorilla tight, which is what we don't want, right? With your kit, these aren't the exact ones, I just grabbed them out of my garage, but you also have associated with the wheels a fairly big, thick washer, right? And that's what we're going to get into, talking about how to get these wheels to stop flopping around so much. And then to retain these, as you put the wheel, and it likes to push that bearing out when you do that. When you have the retaining cap, it's a little bit easier, but you can jam that in there and pop the retaining ring off. So be careful of that. But once all this is set, you put the washer on. It's weird working backwards in your brain. And then you put on what's called the linchpin. And that's what that picture is on the agenda slide. I didn't grab one because I'm a knucklehead, so I'm just going to use, this is known as a cotter pin. Right? Anything that will retain the wheel on the axle will work. The linchpin's the easiest because you can just flip it up, pull the pin out, change the tire, do what you need to. A cotter pin will work. Right? It'll hold it on there. But you have to bend it, unbend it. And there's a limited amount of times where that'll work before they break. So in a pinch, yes, better option, that linch pin that comes with the kit. If you lose them, they sell them at any hardware store like Ace. So that's kind of an overview of the bits that we're going to be talking about. All right, let me see if I want to stay, which mode I want to stay in here. Common errors. Okay, I kind of talked through some of these as we went through the nomenclature, what these things are called. Now, the wheel and washer layout. This is a common error I see. I'll look at a Goblin wheel, and if you notice, let me take this back off. On the inside, there's basically what's a built-in washer on your stub axle. This wide, flat section right here. That's a washer welded to the steering arm. Do I need one on this side? The answer is no, I don't. Might I want to put one on that side? Maybe when it comes to getting the wheel nice and snug on there, but let's put this back in, and you can see as it goes down, bam. So that acts as a washer right there, and the wheel spins nice and free. Now, when you put the washer that comes with the kit on the wheel, on the outboard side, which is really where you want it, and then put your linch pin in, and again, I'm just going to use the cotter pin here. Okay, so now that, per the instructions, looks right, but here's the problem. See all that slop? And what that does is it allows the wheel to move, and it's not all that perceptible, but it can move in camber and it can move in tow, changing where the car is steering. And I noticed on some of the cars going by, especially as the bearing gets worn, there was a lot of, the tires were like bending over further and further and further because of all this slop. So how do we get rid of it? right? You don't want to change in toe, and if you don't understand that, go back to the suspension basics video. Toe is that alignment of the front wheels, toed in, toed out. One, any kind of toe angle is going to slow the car down because the wheels aren't turning nice and straight down the racetrack. But the other thing, if your toe is moving around because the wheels are sloppy, it's going to make it unpredictable, almost impossible to drive, okay? And the camber, that's the tilt of the wheels in and out. That also contributes to difficulty in driving. Maybe not as much as toe, but it certainly doesn't help. So what do we want? We want snug but not tight. Let's go back to the bearing for just a second. What I found working on, helping with a few cars in the lead up to the spring race, was the bearing. It comes with a little bit of grease on it, but it looked like somewhere along the way people put a lot of grease and really packed it in there. Too much grease is bad because it slows, it adds more friction, more resistance to the bearing rolling. The other thing I saw was the older the grease was, the more it became less like grease and more like glue. And so what we did on a couple of the cars was you take this, and I put it in some thinner, some paint thinner type, cleaned it all up, got all the old grease off, and then we put a nice fresh layer of grease on the bearing. Okay. Now, oil in and of itself is too thin. It's just going to run off. And you don't want a super heavy, sticky grease. So it's something in between, some kind of nice light synthetic grease. And that'll let the wheel roll the best that it can. Okay, so how do we snug this baby up? Right. So we know if I put the cotter pin or the linch pin through that hole, you can see all the space. So I put in the bearing that came with the kit. Still, look at all the space between the washer and the hole, the retaining pin. So what you want to do is start working with adding some washers. And it's kind of trial and error. But I've grabbed a few from my garage. And again, these aren't the exact ones. Notice how the gap is getting smaller. And then it looks to me like just one more here, and then I put my cotter pin through, and it's going to depend on what you use to retain your axle, right? The linch pin's a little bit thicker than this, but now with that stack of washers, and admittedly these are thinner, you can get thick ones at Ace. Just make sure the inside hole is big enough to go over your axle. But now look, there's no movement there, there's no slop. But it's not so tight that if I push on it, look, the wheel barely wants to turn. But if I take my pressure away and just leave the washers, it rolls nice and free. But there's none of that sloppiness. And so doing that on both sides will improve the handling and the overall speed of the car dramatically, because it won't be going crazy on toe. It won't be flopping around on the axle. All of that adds rolling resistance. So snug, but not tight. And maybe snug isn't even the perfect word. There's just a tiny bit of slop in there that lets that wheel turn 100% free. Okay? And one more thing while I'm thinking about it. When you put the wheel on, it'll be an obvious thing. Oops, we put it on backwards, but you want the tire valve sticking outboard, right? The place where you put the air in the tires, you put it in backwards, it's bloody impossible to put air in the tires. Okay. Let's see, snug but not tight. And that same idea goes for that nut and bolt. Remember, I was telling you this is a self-locking bolt on the axle. So tighten it down, and I would tighten it to where it is tight. But when you do that, what you're going to find is the steering is going to be super tight, like it may be not even moving. So when it's tight, then back it off a half a turn. Or what we call, if you look at any kind of nut, it's got what are known as flats. Right, a six-sided nut. Tighten it up and then back it off one or two flats so that there's no slop, but the steering moves nice and free. Because again, you have slop in this portion where it's connected to the cross member of the car. The wheel's going to move around on you. Snug, but not tight. Okay, I think that'll help quite a bit with what I saw with the Goblin steering and the kind of wandering around. And I think it contributed to, we had quite a few disqualifications in the slalom because cars just, they were kind of driving themselves, and the driver may be going, I want to go here and point it right, and then that sloppiness kicks in and the car all of a sudden takes off and hits a cone, and now you're disqualified, which is a bummer, right? Okay, so to finish up, and this one's actually going to be about 15 minutes. Go back to the idea of this is all about rolling resistance. You want the minimum rolling resistance so you maximize the battery power. Check the alignment would be first. Check that, what they call toe. Make sure the tires are pointing straight down the racetrack. And again, if you don't remember or you forgot how to adjust it, go back to the suspension basics video and it steps through it for both Goblins and F24s. Are the bearings clean? Do they have fresh grease in them? Right, that's an important piece as well. Let me go back to this so my head isn't so scary. Clean them up, put in fresh grease, roll it in, but don't overpack it with grease, okay? Are the wheels snug but not too tight? That's exactly what we were just talking about. Both the wheel on the axle and the axle as it's bolted to the frame with that large nut and bolt system. Snug but not too tight. And so I'm thinking out loud as I'm putting these ideas down. I thought, well, heck, here's maybe a way to test those changes. Go through and check the toe. Clean the bearings, snug up the wheels, check that the steering's working freely but tight where it's predictable, where I do this and the wheels move that much. And then see if you can find a small hill, like near the school, something like that. Do one change. Actually, even before you do any changes, try this. Put one of your drivers in the car, hold them at a line on this slight hill, let them go, and see how well the car rolls down that slight decline. And I have them hit the brakes, bring it back to the top. Change the toe if it needs it. Let them roll down the hill. Did it help? Right? Either maybe they didn't even make it to the bottom of the hill, or you time it. It took them 17 seconds to get to the bottom, where you put a little mark. Now snug up the wheels. Snug but not tight. Now it took them 14 seconds. Tighten up the steering where it's good and predictable. Now it took them 13 seconds. So there's a way to incrementally make a change, see what it does. Make a change, see what it does. If it makes it worse, maybe you go back and get rid of that change. But I think that'll help with preparation for the next Grand Prix in the fall of 23 and help the cars be more drivable, more predictable, and having less cone incidents on the slalom course especially. And to be honest, we had a lot of collisions with the barrier that were single car accidents that I would put down to the car somewhat driving itself. And guess what? The last thing I'll say about that is if you have all that slop, if you hit a bump, that just makes the situation worse. And those that have driven the car or just watched them drive, you can see the cars with the sloppy kind of steering, when they hit bumps in the track, the car just wants to dart left and right. And absolutely that can contribute to either hitting the barrier or hitting another car, and not necessarily down to the driver doing it poorly, is the car is somewhat driving itself. Okay, so try these things. If you have any questions, certainly contact myself or Madison at Green Spaces, and hopefully you find this useful. I will do a race prep, a more in-depth preparing for a race, talking about some more flagging issues and just kind of some food for thought as we move toward the fall Grand Prix. Okay, see you soon.